And I've also gone through a number of their books as well to try to get an idea. First chapter, I begin by talking about the one who established it, Sheikh Taqiyuddin al-Nabhani, rahimahullah, an establishment. And he was born in 1911 in Palestine, actually. And he has attained degrees from Cairo, from Al-Azhar, and Darul Uloom. As you can see on the screen, he got the status to work as a judge in Sharia. He is actually the nephew of Yusuf al-Nabhani. Yusuf al-Nabhani is his maternal grandfather. And it's known in the realm of the history that he was a Sufi spiritual leader of his time. And we have people the likes of Sheikh Mahmoud al-Alusi, who wrote and refuted some of his opinions about calling out the Prophet ﷺ and so forth. Now I want to make sure that everybody understands that Sheikh Taqiyuddin al-Nabhani was not upon the way of his maternal grandfather. Many people think, oh, he was a Sufi, or he was a Ba'athist, or he was an Arab nationalist. I did my research really as much as I could and made sure that I debunked some of these myths about him, because when you're looking at something like this, it's important not to go after the people, especially those who passed away, because they are Muslims and they passed away regardless if they made any mistakes. My aim was to actually look at the ideology of Hizb ut-Tahrir as a group. The first thing I wanted to mention in chapter 2 is that I wanted to tackle this notion that they have, is that the society, al-mujtama yani, is based on the hukum or the governance, not the manners of the individual. Hizb ut-Tahrir, what you find about them is that they look at themselves as being the political party bloc that is only concerned mainly, as actually, to be honest with you, as a party bloc, they're only concerned with re-establishing the Khilafah. So they criticize, actually, in their books, they criticize the groups, and indirectly the people like the Muslim Brotherhood, they do criticize them because they're focusing on akhlaq, and they said that that's basically something that hasn't done anything for the ummah. And they also talk about the Rasul ﷺ and how Allah described them as وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ, that he has the best of manners, that this is something on the individual level, and it has nothing to do with the society overall and the governance about that. And of course, I respond to that in my book, and I bring the definition of what the khuluq is in the Qur'an. What is meant by khuluqin azim? It's actually Islam, which is comprehensive, which includes tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the manners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why Aisha radiallahu anha described the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam as the Qur'an, that his khuluq was the Qur'an, and that encompassed everything. So they're focused on governance, and they're a group that is only allowed to establish or to work to establish the caliphate as they define it, like the first Muslims, Dar al-Arqam. Now, one thing I'm going to mention about them too is that, and this is all detailed in the book, and I'm trying my best to condense as much as I could, they look at the world today entirely as Dar al-Kufr. So they're taking us back to the Meccan period. So it's like we're doing this all over again. And the reason for this that they say is that, first of all, only one leader is allowed to overall the Muslims. They don't accept any other opinion about this. They say only one leader is allowed, and the Islamic Sharia has to be applied 100%. Otherwise, the realm or the land that we're living in is Dar al-Kufr. So they look at today at the entire world as Dar al-Kufr. Now, I'm not talking about the difference of opinion among scholars who say that if a ruler legislates by other than what Allah has revealed, that some of them say that he becomes a kafir and that his land becomes Dar al-Kufr. And some say, no, it's a kufr lesser than kufr, depending on the circumstance. It's a case-by-case scenario. I'm not talking about that khilaf between the scholars of the Sunnah. I'm talking about wholesale saying that the entire world today is Dar al-Kufr. So they're taking us back to the Meccan period and saying that we're back to square one again, up to the Meccan period just before the Rasul ﷺ migrated to Medina and established the Islamic State. And I'll get into that a little bit more. And when they talk about this, they talk about when did the caliphate actually end. And I go into chapter 3. And they, of course, they'll tell you that the Ottoman Empire was the last caliphate in 1924, and they insisted it's a caliphate. And I analyzed this, and again, I'm giving a very brief outline here of this, but there are a hadith of the Messenger ﷺ. For example, we have one here in Sunan Abi Dawood, when he said that the Khilafah of Prophet will last for 30 years, and Allah will give power or His kingdom to whoever He wills. And also there's another hadith in Muslim Ahmad, and there are others, by the way, these aren't the only ones, that the Prophet will remain amongst you for as long as Allah wills it to be, that Allah will raise it when He wills to raise it, then there will be the Khilafah upon the prophetic methodology, and it will last for as long as Allah wills it to last. So this is Khilafatul Nubuwah, right, the Khulafa Rashidun of the 30 years. then Allah will raise it when He wants to raise it, then there will be abiding kingship, يعني الملك العض, and it will remain for as long as Allah wills it to remain, then Allah will raise it when He wills to raise it, then there will be tyrannical, forceful kingship, يعني ملك جائر. Now we're getting into, and this is the stage that we're in right now, and it will remain for as long as Allah wills it to remain, then He will raise it when He wills to raise it, then there will be a khilafah upon the prophetic methodology. Now, everybody knows that the next stage in Muslim history that is coming up, and Allahu A'lam when that's going to be, is that Khilafat al-Nubuwwah is next. And the Rasul and other hadith mentioned that the first of it will be Nubuwwatun wa Rahmah, it will be prophethood and mercy. Then it'll be Mulkun wa Rahmah, monarchy or kingship and Rahmah. And then he says that then there will come a stage in history where they will bite each other like wild donkeys. They will fight each other for rulership. Right? So in that chapter, actually, I show that after the 30-year caliphate, was the Rasul named it literally a caliphate. After that came the mulk in its various manifestations. Now, the other thing that they talk about is the issue of secularism and the issue of legislating with other than what Allah has revealed, meaning legislating with laws that go against the Sharia. And I've just started off the chapter by saying the impression that one gets when reviewing the position of Hizb ut-Tahrir is that secularism began after the demise of the Ottoman Empire in 1924. The issue of man-made laws or the replacement of Islamic laws with secular laws actually began during the era of the Ottomans. This is something that is not really brought to the forefront a lot, because the impression is that, well, we had a caliphate from the beginning of Abu Bakr all the way until the Dawla al-Uthmaniyya, and then suddenly it's gone. And now we're into this realm. Even though the stages of governance have been foretold by the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there's no ambiguity in that. So I did a lot of research on this one, and I didn't even say anything from myself. I just brought things that were documented. For example, they've adopted a criminal code in 1840, which was later developed in 1857, a commercial code in 1850 until 1860 when it was amended, and other codes, and they were all borrowed from the French legal system, right? And one of the most important consequences, as it says here, of the promulgation of the new secular codes was the creation of a system, of course, called Nizamiyya. So they started having these other secular courts alongside the Sharia courts under the empire itself, and they worked in close cooperation for several decades. But by 1917, these Nizamiyya courts they superseded Sharia courts in all civil and criminal matters, leaving only inheritance and family law. In the 16th century, the awqaf or the pious foundations were allowed by the government to loan money for interest. So riba was something that started, and also the Imperial Ottoman Bank was established in 1856 in London, UK, which the Ottoman Empire had a minority shares in it, but they were allowing the bank to loan money for interest because it was in Dar al-Harb, or the land of war, basically, where they follow the Hanafi method, that you were able to take interest from the disbelievers as in that kind of situation. There was also the decriminalization of homosexual acts in 1858. Now, this chapter that I talked about here wasn't meant to undermine the Ottoman Empire because of all the things that they've done for Islam. Anybody with any intelligence would know that they did a lot for Islam if they studied history properly. But I'm just showing the readers and as those who will read the book that it's not just, I turn on the light, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, and then I turn off the light right in 1924. That's not how it works. There was a progression. And at the end, inshallah, I will allow some time for questions. In chapter 5, I asked the question how the caliphate was destroyed, or why was the caliphate destroyed. See, Hizb ut-Tahrir, they talk about how it was destroyed. They went to an analysis and they went into the internal and external enemies and so on. But I said in this chapter that it's better to look at why was the caliphate destroyed. What happened? In the previous chapter before that, we talked about secularism, ruling by man-made laws, which happened in the Ottoman Empire. They took on the constitution of the French and other things that they've imported. And also the issue of shirk that took place with the Sufism that was taking place. And one of those people that I mentioned in the beginning, Yusuf al-Nabhani, which is the maternal grandfather of Taqiyuddin Nabhani, he was working for the different posts for the government, and he was among those who were trying to use the government to support his beliefs in Sufism, and unfortunately in the issues of shirk and so on that ended up happening with regards to calling people in the graves and so on like that. So I mean, there were many mistakes that happened towards the end of the Dawla al-Uthmaniyya and throughout as well. In chapter 6, obviously the claim, and this shows the importance of applying the Sharia, right? That hadith is saying that as long as these rulers don't apply the Sharia, they're going to continue fighting. It means they're going to be divided, right? So that means that if the rulers are advised and shown, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us better rulers who apply the Sharia, If the more Sharia is applied, the more these rulers will cooperate with each other. And the more they will unite and the more they will cooperate, bi'idhnillah, right? So in this chapter, I'm talking about whose responsibility is it? Is it just anybody in the ummah? Because Hizb ut-Tahrir makes it out to sound like, well, all of us are in sin because there's no Khalifa that's established over all the Muslims. Again, in Muslim history, various scholars who said that the Khilafah is an obligation, they said this. Many scholars have said this. The Khilafah is an obligation. What do they mean by that? Did they mean that the Khilafat al-Nubuwwah was an obligation? Ibn Taymiyyah said it. He mentioned it in one of his writings, right? But does that mean that all the different forms of governance that happen after, that those are haram, that those are not allowed, that those are illegitimate ways of ruling? You know, the hereditary monarchy that we had that took place ever since Muawiyah radiallahu anhu gave it to his son Yazid, right? And Yazid, you know, he's not a Sahabi, right? He made mistakes, no doubt about it, and he wasn't the ideal leader. But Muawiyah gave it to him because he saw it that his son was able, and there were circumstances at that time because Muawiyah, Al-Hasan radiallahu anhu, he gave up the Khilafah and gave it to Muawiyah, and Muawiyah set about himself on the first king, and the monarchy started, right? So Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, because he was the ruler of Sham at the time, he ruled the Sham. Banu Umayyah, they supported him a lot. So for him at that time, one of the reasons why he appointed his son Yazid is because if he appointed anybody else, then there would have been a lot of problems and people would not have accepted it. So again, this is a detailed topic that went to the history and the reasons why he did it and so on. But you're going to find later on that this is something that they use, unfortunately, in a bad way. We're looking at some of these personalities. So we're looking at a possible union between Muslims today. This is something that is up to the people that are in the political realm. It's not just for anybody to come and try to create a group here, create a group there, and recreate history again and say, well, we're back to the Meccan period again, and the whole world is Dar al-Kufr, as if no Muslim exists today. Today we have Muslims. We have one quarter of the earth is Muslim. We have nation state. So you can't make qiyas with today's situation as it was before the Rasul ﷺ migrated to Medina. And that's what these brothers are doing, which I think is a very big mistake on their part. Now, this first part of the book I get into is all to do with the political aspect of it. Of course, I could not ignore the Aqidah matters. Chapters 12 to 14, I dealt with Aqidah matters. Hizb ut-Tahrir spoke about Al-Hasan al-Basri, which we know is a very pious tabi'i. But then they put him along with Wasim ibn Ata, who's the founder of the Mu'tazila, Ghalan al-Dimashqi, who's a Qadari, who was executed by the Khalifa of his time because of his beliefs in Qadar, and Al-Jabal ibn Safwan, and others. They grouped them all as defenders of Islam. So Hizb ut-Tahrir is very neutral when it comes to the different Aqidah that is in the Ummah. Even if his Aqidah is something heretical, they have no problem with the Shia, for example. They think the Shia are fine and dandy and we can get along with them as long as we establish the Khilafah. They have no issues with that. And I get into that in the book in a lot of detail. Their definition of Iman, I get into that. They don't consider actions to be part of Iman. This is part of the definition. So they're more towards, not saying they're Murji'ah per se, but they have aspects of the Murji'ah, right? Names the attributes of Allah. They look at them in the sense that, they look at them in the sense of tafweed, that they have no meanings that we know of, that the names and attributes of Allah in the Qur'an or the Sunnah, there's no meanings to those words. We just leave it up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and we just don't even give them meanings, period, right? Which is not the way of the Salaf actually. Hizb ut-Tahrir, with the issue of ahadith as well. I get into this particular topic in detail about whether to take aqidah from hadith ahad. And they say, no, you can't take aqidah from hadith ahad. In fact, they say it's haram to do that. That's how far they go with it. And I go to the origins of that. It goes back to Wasil ibn Ata, it goes back to the Mu'tazila, it goes back to those groups that started off by saying that, well, hadith ahad can be taken into aqidah. And classifying hadith, by the way, nothing is wrong with saying ahad and mutawatir. But when you start to deny ahad in the way that they've done, this is where the problem is. Chapter 15, I talk about the Mahdi. And I even, this is one of the things I have in the book here, one of two things or three things when they talk about the Mahdi, and about him reestablishing the Khilafah and so on. Can it be established without him? They were asked the question, they said, no, there's no definitive evidence in the Qur'an or the Sunnah for such an understanding. In fact, there are authentic hadith which indicate that Imam Mahdi will descend at a time when people are arguing about the succession of a Khalifa. A very detailed topic, which implies that there already exists a Khilafah, that there's already a Caliphate when he comes. And they say the commands by Allah, is true by Islam, are decisive, and again, to the end of it, right? So they don't believe in the Mahdi in the sense that this is something that is definitive, right? They say, well, maybe not, right? Because again, of this ahad hadith and the mutawatir hadith. But the reality is, even the issue of the Mahdi is mutawatir bil-ma'na, that the hadith about the Mahdi are concurrent in terms of their meaning. They're not concurrent in terms of exact wording of hadith, but they're concurrent, recurringly concurrent, and they're mutawatir at the level of definitiveness, right? That there will be somebody who will come and will establish the Khilafah at the end of time. Now, does that mean that we'll go to sleep and say, let's wait for the Mahdi? That's what some people think. You guys are just saying sleep. No, there are things that we have to do for this as well. One of them is, like I had in the earlier chapter, in the inevitable caliphate, is that the Muslims should try to, with themselves, their best to apply the Sharia and try to unite some of these fragmented states and bring them together at the political level, right? But when the Mahdi comes, there's going to be a different kind of detail. And I argue in my book that as far as the Khilafat al-Nubuwwah is concerned, in its pure form, that's what the Mahdi will do. What happens before that, in terms of a potential caliphate in the sense of having unity between Muslims coming together under less leaders perhaps, or maybe one leader, Allahu A'lam, that can happen. But in its pure form, the way that the Khulafa Rashidun had it, this will be the Mahdi and will not be anybody before him. Some scholars along the Sunnah, they don't agree with that. Some of them said this is how it is, some of them said no. When I looked at it myself, looked at the hadith of the Mahdi and so on, I came to that conclusion that from the hadith and the way the transition is, it makes sense to me that the Mahdi will be the one to do it. Again, it doesn't mean that we slack off and don't do anything. There is work to be done, whether it's at the individual level or the institutional level or the societal level or the government level. There's lots of work to be done. Chapter 16, I talk about the At-Tafsir al-Siyasi lid-Din, the political pan-Islamic worldview when it terms on Islam, right? This is a deep topic as well. Because to understand these groups, whether it's Hizb At-Tahrir or Ikhwan al-Muslimun or Jama'at al-Islami, Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi, rahimahumullah, and so on, to understand the ideology of these groups, you have to understand the tafsir al-siyasa that they came up with. All or almost all of Islam is interpreted through a political worldview, and hence its true maxims are compromised. When I went through this is one of the longer chapters in my book. When I went through this,